We're ready.
Once again, I want to welcome you. My name is Curtis Sellers. I'm an electrical instructor here at Central Louisiana Technical Community College. And this is really part 4 of a electrical educational series of videos that we are giving additional resources to our students that will ideally aid them in continuing their education and certainly allow them to have resources as maybe they run into various problems with some of the things that we discuss in class. And so this series here is going to continue with that thought. We've discussed a 3-bend saddle at this point. We've talked about a offset. We've talked about a stub 90, as we call it. And then of course, there was an introductory video that actually provided some, I guess you would say, introductory concepts on bending. And so this is going to be a continuation, 4-bend saddle. And a 4-bend saddle, if you remember from our earlier video, is a saddle type bend that is used anytime we're going over a circular or a rectangle type instruction. The 4-bend saddle, very similar to a 3-bend saddle in that the name kind of gives you some information. There's actually a combination of 4 separate bends that happens to complete this 4-bend saddle. But the easy way for me to think about a 4-bend saddle is it's just a combination of 2 separate offsets. And so you have an offset here and you have an offset here. And so a 4-bend saddle is really just a combination of 2 separate offsets that is accomplished by making 4 bends. And so what I'm going to do now is demonstrate the measurements that we take into account. Of course, we will have shrinkage and we will have our multipliers that we have to use. And in this case, I'll allow my camera operator time to come around and maybe get a panoramic view. Once again, we've used our airline on the previous videos as the exterior of a wall. And of course, you can see that we've got a rectangular obstruction represented by the metal box there. And so what we hope to accomplish is to get our measurements of the distance between our wall and the box, and the distance, how wide that particular box is. And then we want to kind of, for any shrinkage, and calculate our multipliers and make this 4-bend saddle in such a way that we're able to, in essence, start here at the beginning of our wall, come over, up, over, back down, and return to that same plane, allowing just enough clearance to get over the top of that box. So the first measurement that we would make is very similar to what we've done on the 3-bend saddle and what we've done on the offset. Is we want to determine the distance from the exterior edge of, in this case, that compressed air pipe to the inside edge of our box, and that is represented by 44 inches. And so we can take, and I've already done this for time's sake, place that 44 inches on the board. And so we would have to now account for any shrinkage that we're going to have as a result of making that bend. And I am going to use, in this case, a 30-degree bend on all of these bends. And so our shrinkage is 1/4 of an inch for every inch of height of obstruction. And of course, I've already measured this out, and it comes in at right about 3.5 inches. And so the math there is fairly simple whenever we're using a 30-degree bend. For every inch of height, in this case we've got 3.5, we add an additional 1/4 of an inch. And so roughly what I did is I added 1 inch approximately. We fall kind of right in between that 3/4 and that 1 inch mark. And so I went ahead and added 1 inch. And so our first mark would be 45 inches. What that 45 inches represents is the distance from our compressed air pipe to the inside edge of our obstruction plus 1 inch of shrinkage. I'll place all those marks on the pipe in a minute. Remember I told you as we started this that we will have 4 separate bends. So this would represent our first bend. A lot of times whenever I transcribe this mark on my pipe, I like to place a 1 beside it just for my memory's sake so I can remember where I'm bending. Our second bend represents the width of our obstruction. So the first bend is going to get us up and over. Our second bend tells us how far before we begin that turn back down. In this case, this rectangular box is approximately 7 inches wide. And so that would be represented right here on our third bend. You would determine how wide it is. And then our second and fourth bend is simply using our multiplier, determining how far apart we space our actual third and fourth bend from the actual first and second bend that we've already identified up here. And so what we would do is we would take that 3.5 inches height of obstruction, and once again we would multiply it times 2. Again, that 2 is an easy number. That's why a lot of electricians always use the 30-degree bend. It's kind of a go-to. You would take 3.5 or 3.75 if we add just a little bit of clearance and multiply that times 2, and we get a distance of 7.5 represented on either side of our first 2 marks. So let me show you what that looks like whenever we put it on the pipe. We're going to take our first mark and we're going to place a markage at 45 inches. And I think I'll do this with the actual red marker so it'll be very visible. And so I'm going to place a mark at 45 inches. Now I will have to be very careful with this because it is a dry eraser marker and it is going to have a tendency to rub off if I'm not careful. But that mark is going to represent my first bend. And so I place a little 1 there beside it. Now, I have to determine how wide my actual rectangular box is. We've already said it's 7 inches. So I could simply come to my first bend and I could take and mark 7 inches. And I'm going to come and transcribe that on here as well. Now we have to factor in our multiplier. And so what we've got at this point, if you're able to see the conduit, you're able to see where the bend starts. You're able to see where the bend actually comes across the top of the rectangular box, and then that bend begins to go back down. And so what we've got to determine now is where our 2 multipliers would be located. And again, that's a simple math function based on a multiplier of 2 times the height of our obstruction, which means we would place a mark at 7.5 inches on either side of these first 2 marks. We could do the math, or we could simply take a tape measure and use it to our advantage by simply placing it at 7.5 and marking, and coming on the other side and placing it at 7.5 and marking it also. And again, I'm gonna have to be very careful with these marks because they're gonna have a tendency to rub off if I'm not careful. But I'm marking it in red, perhaps to make it a little more visible. And so we have our calculations in place. And so now all we would need to do would be to take our pipe, take our conduit bender. All bends is going to be accomplished in the air, is how I like to say it. And remember, not that it necessarily is critical whether I start on this bend or this bend, but I tell you, I like to mark mine so I can get a reference point of what bend I intended to be first. And so I'm going to take that bend that's marked number 1, and I'm going to place it inside my conduit bender. I'm going to line it up on my hook. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm actually, in hindsight, just based on keeping my hook towards the obstruction, I'm going to go ahead and do this bend here first. And so it is critical to keep the hook pointing towards our obstruction. And so I could make this bend, but I would have to rotate the pipe. And so I'm going to go ahead and make this bend here first. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up with our arrow here. And again, we have no consideration on the first bend about worrying about a dog leg or anything of that nature, because it is the first bend. And so all we have to do is, once again, get very comfortable, placing it under our shoulder, placing our foot on the pipe. And again, all of these bends are going to be performed at the 30-degree bend. And that's going to be represented right here on our conduit bender. And so we're going to come down and we're going to stop right at the very top of it. Now again, think of these bends as two offsets, one on this side and one on that side. So with that thought in mind, we're going to rotate the pipe. We're going to place our multiplier mark that was 7.5 inches from our first bend. And we are going to be concerned about sighting down the conduit. Once again, if we allow our pipe to get out of line with our handle, we would have what we call a dog leg in the tray. And so what we want to do is, A, make sure we're lined up, mark on arrow, put a little bit of downward pressure on it so that it doesn't slip on us, and then just kind of sight down. And once you have that, keep that downward pressure so the pipe can't move. And then just repeat what you've previously done. You want to place your foot on the handle. You're going to get a good firm grip, and you're going to come down and you're going to stop right at the top of the 30-degree bend. So, first series of offsets are done. Next bend would be coming over and repeating what we've previously done. So, obviously we're going to rotate the pipe. We're going to line up. Notice one of the things that we covered earlier was that the hook always faces the obstruction. This is the obstruction. This is where we're going over that rectangular box. So the first thing we would line up would be our mark with our arrow. And it becomes really critical that we also back up just a little bit and kind of get everything nice in line to avoid those dog legs. Keeping downward pressure. Placing our hand and our shoulder, and that we're going to bend down to a 30-degree angle. And then we're going to rotate. And you can begin even now to start seeing the shape of a 4-bend saddle beginning to take place. And so we just want to repeat what we've previously done. Notice, hook is still facing the obstruction. We've kept that. We actually haven't moved the direction of our hand bender, our conduit bender, since we began. We've simply rotated the pipe around it. And so once again, we're going to sight down our conduit. And again, if you can imagine a neutral plane between the conduit and between the handle, they're all on one plane. And if we get that lined up, keeping downward pressure, all we would do is place our foot, and we would slowly, once again, bend down to a 30-degree bend. Now, you can start to see the shape of a 4-bend saddle having taken place. You can see, I'll kind of hold it up here to represent what we were hoping to accomplish. I don't remember what end, I think it was this end here that was represented by our box. And you can see that comes out, let me get it, that comes out just about perfect right there. We've got just a slight amount of clearance over the top of our obstruction, and of course we lined up and we're jumping right over the top of it. And so that is a 4-bend saddle. Again, if you think of it as two opposing offsets, perhaps it makes it easier to understand. And so that would conclude the demonstration on 4-bend saddles, and certainly we will continue going forward. Our goal is to continue to offer these educational videos to help our students. The next topic has not been determined yet, but be on the lookout for future videos that explains concepts of electrical fundamentals. Thank you.